A racist police officer assumes that a black man in the park is a criminal and arrests him for no reason. Afterwards, the officer realizes that he has just arrested an FBI agent. Marcus Davis sat on a weathered bench in Riverside Park, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the lush greenery. He turned a page in the book he was reading, momentarily losing himself in the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing. The park was one of his favorite places, a small sanctuary in a bustling city where he could clear his mind and escape the demands of his job. Today, though, his thoughts were interrupted. Across the park, Officer Brian Harkins patrolled the area, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. He had walked this beat for over 2 decades, and in his mind, he knew this city better than anyone. When he noticed Marcus sitting alone on the bench, something in his gut stirred, a feeling he had learned to trust over the years. A black man, sitting alone, too calm, too composed. Suspicion prickled at the edges of his thoughts. Never seen him around here before, Brian muttered under his breath. He stopped walking and watched Marcus for a moment, trying to place the feeling. There had been reports of a suspect fitting a general description that matched Marcus, a vague, flimsy lead. But it was enough for Brian. Marcus felt the weight of someone's gaze and looked up from his book. He noticed Brian standing a distance away, staring at him with a look that was all too familiar. Marcus had been in situations like this before. He could read the officer's expression easily, prejudice masquerading as concern, a suspicion that had no basis other than the color of his skin. But Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his book slowly, marking the page with a finger, and met Brian's gaze. Brian's grip on his baton tightened. He saw the way Marcus looked at him, steady, unafraid. It unnerved him. "Let's see what this guy's up to," Brian muttered as he started walking towards Marcus, his posture stiffening with each step. He didn't like how Marcus was looking at him, didn't like the calmness, the lack of fear. It was unsettling. Marcus watched Brian approach, keeping his expression neutral. He knew what was coming and had seen it many times before. The situation was already loaded, and he knew that how he responded in the next few moments could determine how it played out. He wasn't in the mood for this today, but he also wasn't going to give the officer any reason to escalate the situation. "Afternoon," Brian said as he reached the bench. His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it. Marcus could hear the underlying suspicion. "Afternoon," Marcus replied, his voice calm and even. He kept his hands visible, resting them on the closed book in his lap. "What brings you out here today?" Brian asked, his eyes scanning Marcus's face, then flicking to the book. He was fishing for something, anything, to justify the feeling gnawing at him. "Just enjoying the park," Marcus said. "It's a nice day." Brian nodded slowly, though he wasn't really listening. He was more interested in what Marcus wasn't saying, in what he could dig out from beneath the surface. "You from around here?" Marcus smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around." The non-answer didn't sit well with Brian. He shifted his weight, his stance becoming more confrontational. "Mind if I see some ID?" Marcus's smile faded. This was the point where things could go sideways. He knew his rights, knew he wasn't obligated to show ID just for sitting in a public park, but he also knew that refusing could escalate the situation quickly. Still, he wasn't going to let this officer intimidate him. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked, his tone measured. He met Brian's gaze without flinching. Brian bristled at the question. There was that calmness again, that refusal to be intimidated. It made him uneasy, made him feel like he was losing control of the situation. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Brian shot back, his hand moving to rest on his holster. Marcus took a slow breath, keeping his expression neutral. He didn't like where this was heading, but he wasn't going to back down. "I'm just sitting in a park," he said, his voice steady. "Is there a law against that?" Brian's patience was wearing thin. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though even he knew how weak the excuse sounded. He stepped closer, looming over Marcus. Marcus didn't move. He held Brian's gaze, refusing to give him the reaction he was looking for. "And what description is that?" Marcus asked quietly. Brian's jaw tightened. He didn't have a good answer, and he knew it. But admitting that would mean losing face, losing control. He wasn't about to let that happen. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Show me some ID now." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension thickening between them. Marcus knew he could push back and could assert his rights, but he also knew that doing so could make this situation even more dangerous. He decided to comply for now. Without a word, he reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. Brian watched every movement closely, his body coiled like a spring. When Marcus handed over his ID, Brian snatched it out of his hand and glanced at it. The name didn't mean anything to him, but that didn't matter. He'd already made up his mind. "Stand up," Brian ordered, stepping back to give Marcus room. Marcus sighed inwardly, but did as he was told, rising slowly from the bench. He kept his hands visible, not wanting to give Brian any reason to claim he felt threatened. "Turn around," Brian said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Marcus felt a surge of frustration, but pushed it down. He turned around, letting Brian cuff him without resistance. He could hear people nearby, could feel their eyes on him, but he stayed calm, knowing that the worst thing he could do now was give in to anger. As Brian tightened the cuffs around Marcus's wrists, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that he was making a mistake. But his pride wouldn't let him stop now. He grabbed Marcus's arm and started leading him towards the patrol car parked nearby. Marcus didn't say a word as they walked, his mind already shifting to what would come next. He wasn't worried about himself. He knew who he was, knew that this officer would find out soon enough, but he couldn't help but feel a deep weariness, a tiredness that went beyond this one encounter. It was the exhaustion of knowing that, despite all his accomplishments, all his efforts, he was still seen as just another black man in the eyes of too many people like Officer Brian Harkins. As they reached the patrol car, Brian opened the back door and guided Marcus inside, the tension still hanging in the air. Marcus settled into the seat, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. He looked out the window as the car pulled away from the park, watching the trees blur past, wondering how this day, like so many others, had gone so wrong. The patrol car's engine hummed as Officer Brian Harkins drove Marcus Davis toward the precinct. Brian's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white as he processed what had just happened. He didn't like the way Marcus had looked at him back there in the park, calm, unafraid, like he knew something Brian didn't. It gnawed at him, made him question his instincts, but his pride wouldn't let him admit that. Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him. The city streets blurred by, but his mind wasn't on the passing scenery. Instead, he was focused on what would happen next. He knew the system, knew how quickly things could escalate if he wasn't careful, but he also knew his own power, the authority that came with his position, an authority that Officer Harkins had no idea about. As they neared the precinct, Brian glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "What were you really doing in that park?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Marcus met Brian's eyes in the mirror, his expression unreadable. "I told you," he replied calmly. "I was just reading," Brian scoffed. "A guy like you, just sitting around reading? You expect me to believe that?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A guy like me?" he repeated, his tone measured. Brian hesitated for a moment, realizing the slip in his words. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You don't look like someone who spends his afternoons reading in the park," he said, trying to justify his actions. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, the tension in the car thickening. When he finally spoke, his voice was cool, controlled. "And what does someone like me look like, officer?" Brian didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew what he was implying, knew how it sounded, but he wasn't about to admit that to Marcus or to himself. Instead, he focused on driving, his frustration mounting as Marcus's calm demeanor continued to unsettle him. The car pulled into the precinct's parking lot, and Brian parked near the entrance. He got out first, then opened the back door and helped Marcus out, the cuffs still digging into Marcus's wrists. As they walked toward the building, Brian's thoughts raced. He needed to figure out what to do next. This wasn't how arrests were supposed to go. The suspect was supposed to be scared, compliant, not composed, and challenging him with every word. Inside the precinct, the usual buzz of activity filled the air. Officers filing reports, phones ringing, the hum of conversation. Brian led Marcus through the main hall, ignoring the curious glances from other officers. He didn't want to explain himself just yet, not until he was sure of his next move. They reached the booking area, and Brian signaled for Marcus to stand by the processing desk. The officer behind the desk, a young man named Officer Jenkins, looked up, surprised to see Brian bringing someone in. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked, his eyes flicking to Marcus, then back to Brian. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," Brian replied, his tone clipped. He handed over Marcus's ID, still unwilling to admit that he didn't have a solid reason for the arrest. Jenkins glanced at the ID, then back at Marcus. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but he quickly masked it, nodding as he began typing into the computer. Marcus noticed the brief hesitation, filing it away in his mind. The recognition was subtle, but it was there. Someone in this precinct knew who he was. Captain Bennett's in her office, Jenkins said as he handed the ID back to Brian. You'll need to take him to her. Brian stiffened slightly. Captain Laura Bennett was known for being tough but fair, a stickler for procedure. He hadn't planned on involving her so soon, but he didn't have a choice. All right, Brian said, his voice tight. He turned to Marcus, his grip firm on Marcus's arm. Let's go. Marcus walked beside Brian, his expression still unreadable. As they approached Captain Bennett's office, he could sense the tension in Brian, the uncertainty that the officer was trying so hard to hide. It was the first crack in the armor, and Marcus noted it with quiet satisfaction. Brian knocked on the door, then opened it when he heard Captain Bennett's voice from inside. The office was neat, organized, with a large desk in the center and shelves lined with books and files. Captain Bennett, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her paperwork as they entered. Officer Harkins, she said, her tone neutral. What's this about? Brian stepped forward, guiding Marcus into the room. Caught this guy in the park, Captain. He was acting suspicious. Wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID. Captain Bennett's gaze shifted to Marcus, and for a split second, there was a flicker of recognition, just like Jenkins. But she quickly masked it, her expression turning professional. Is that so? She said, her voice even. Marcus met her eyes and saw the recognition there. He knew that Captain Bennett was aware of who he was, but she was playing it carefully, waiting to see how Brian would handle the situation. That's right, Brian continued, oblivious to the silent exchange between Marcus and Bennett. I brought him in for questioning. Captain Bennett nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. I see. And did you have probable cause to arrest him? Brian hesitated, feeling the ground beneath him start to shift. He wouldn't cooperate, Captain, he repeated, though it sounded weaker this time. Captain Bennett leaned back in her chair, studying Brian carefully. Officer Harkins, why don't you step outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with Mr. Davis alone. Brian blinked, taken aback by the request. But Captain, outside, Harkins, Bennett said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Brian released Marcus and stepped out of the office, closing the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Captain Bennett's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming less formal. Mr. Davis, she said, her voice calm, I apologize for this misunderstanding. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job. Bennett sighed, glancing at the closed door. I'm aware of who you are, but I'd appreciate it if we kept that under wraps for now. I need to handle this situation carefully. Marcus nodded. Of course, I'm not here to cause trouble, Captain. I just want to make sure things are handled properly. They will be, Bennett assured him. I'll speak with Officer Harkins and deal with this appropriately, but I have to ask, why didn't you just tell him who you are? Marcus's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. Because it shouldn't matter, Captain. My identity shouldn't be the reason he decides to treat me with respect. Captain Bennett considered his words, then nodded in understanding. You're right. It shouldn't matter. But unfortunately, it does to some people. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. Finally, Captain Bennett stood up. I'll call Officer Harkins back in. We'll resolve this. Marcus nodded again, watching as Captain Bennett moved to the door. The confrontation wasn't over, but he knew he had the upper hand now. The truth would come out soon enough, and Officer Harkins would have to face the consequences of his actions. As Captain Bennett opened the door, Brian stepped back inside, his expression wary. He could sense that something had shifted, but he didn't know what. He glanced at Marcus, who stood calmly, waiting. Mr. Davis here is not the man you are looking for. You'll release him immediately. Brian blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. What? But Captain, he... Immediately, officer, Bennett repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument. Brian hesitated, then finally reached for the keys to unlock Marcus's handcuffs. His hand shook slightly as he did so, the realization of his mistake beginning to dawn on him. As the cuffs clicked open, Marcus rubbed his wrists, giving Brian a measured look. Thank you, officer, he said, his tone calm but carrying an undertone of finality. Brian swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. You're free to go, he muttered, stepping back. Marcus nodded and turned to Captain Bennett. I'll be in touch, Captain, he said quietly. There's still a lot to discuss. Captain Bennett nodded in return, understanding the weight behind his words. I look forward to it, Mr. Davis. With that, Marcus walked out of the office, leaving Brian standing there, a sinking feeling in his gut. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were only beginning. Brian Harkins sat at his desk in the precinct, the tension in his body refusing to dissipate. He had barely been able to concentrate since Captain Bennett had released Marcus Davis. The unease gnawed at him, deepened by the fact that he still didn't understand what had just happened. He knew he had made a mistake, but the full extent of it was still out of reach. The silence of the precinct around him was both comforting and unnerving, a space for his thoughts to spiral. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approaching his desk snapped him out of his reverie. He looked up to see Captain Bennett walking toward him, her expression serious. Brian's stomach tightened. He knew this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Officer Harkins, my office. Now," Captain Bennett said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Brian stood up immediately, trying to suppress the nervousness that was beginning to creep into his demeanor. He followed her to the office, each step feeling heavier than the last. Once inside, Captain Bennett closed the door behind him and gestured for him to sit. Brian hesitated for a moment before sitting down. He could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken weight of what was coming. Captain Bennett moved behind her desk, took a deep breath, and then sat down across from him, her sharp eyes fixed on his. "Officer Harkins," she began, her tone measured but stern. "Do you have any idea who Marcus Davis is?" Brian shook his head, his confusion deepening. "No, Captain. Just some guy in the park." Captain Bennett leaned forward, her gaze never leaving Brian's. "Marcus Davis isn't just some guy in the park. He's a special agent, one of their top agents, in fact." The words hit Brian like a physical blow. His eyes widened in shock, the implications of what he had done crashing down on him. "An FBI agent?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's right," Bennett said, her voice firm. "And more than that, he's highly respected within the Bureau. His arrest is going to have serious consequences, not just for you, but for this entire precinct." Brian's mind raced, trying to piece together what this meant. He had profiled and arrested an innocent man, a federal agent no less, based on nothing more than his own biased assumptions. The enormity of his mistake began to settle in, bringing with it a cold, creeping dread. "I didn't know, Captain," Brian said, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem, Harkins," Bennett replied, her tone still firm. "It shouldn't have mattered who he was. Your actions were based on assumptions and prejudices, not on any real evidence. You can't arrest someone just because they don't look like they belong in a park." Brian wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew Captain Bennett was right. He had let his biases guide his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. "What happens now?" Brian asked, his voice low, almost resigned. Captain Bennett sighed, leaning back in her chair. "For now, you're being placed on temporary leave while we investigate this incident. I've already spoken with the higher-ups, and they're not happy, to say the least. There will be an official review, and depending on the outcome, you could face disciplinary action, up to and including termination." Brian's heart sank. Termination. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. He had been a cop for over 2 decades, and the thought of losing his job, his career, was almost too much to bear. But as much as he wanted to deny it, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. I understand, Captain," Brian finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Bennett studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "I know this isn't easy to hear, Harkins, but you need to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for the people you serve. We can't afford to have officers who let their biases dictate their decisions." Brian nodded, though his mind was still reeling. The reality of his situation was starting to sink in, and with it came a flood of regret. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who upheld the law and protected the community. But now all of that was in jeopardy because of one careless, prejudiced decision. Captain Bennett stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "You're dismissed, Officer Harkins. I'll notify you when the review is scheduled." Brian stood up as well, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Thank you, Captain," he mumbled, before turning and walking out of the office. As he left the precinct, the familiar sights and sounds that had once brought him comfort now felt distant, almost alien. He walked to his car in a daze, the reality of his situation pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He had been a cop for so long that he didn't know who he was without the badge. The thought of losing it, of being branded as a failure, terrified him. But beneath the fear, there was something else, an unfamiliar sense of doubt. For the first time, Brian was forced to confront the fact that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the upstanding officer he had always believed himself to be. That maybe he had let his biases and prejudices guide his actions more than he was willing to admit. As he drove home, the city streets passing by in a blur, Brian couldn't shake the image of Marcus Davis's calm, unflinching gaze. It was a look that had unsettled him from the start, and now he understood why. Marcus had seen right through him, had known exactly what was happening, even before Brian himself did. When Brian finally arrived home, he sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel. The day's events played over and over in his mind, each repetition making the weight of his actions heavier. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that his life had just changed irrevocably. With a heavy sigh, Brian got out of the car and walked into his house, the silence of the empty rooms pressing in on him. He sank into a chair, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, regret, and uncertainty. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to do next. Brian Harkins stood in the corridor outside the conference room, his heart pounding in his chest. The precinct was quieter than usual, the atmosphere heavy with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. The official review was about to begin, and Brian knew that every word he said in the next hour would determine the future of his career. He glanced at his reflection in the window across from him. The man staring back looked older, more worn than he had just days ago. There was a stiffness in his posture, a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He straightened his uniform, took a deep breath, and forced himself to focus. This was his chance to explain, to justify his actions, though deep down he wasn't sure how to do that anymore. The door to the conference room opened, and Captain Bennett appeared, her expression unreadable. "We're ready for you, Officer Harkins," she said, her voice steady. Brian nodded, swallowing hard as he followed her into the room. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The long table was lined with stern-faced officials, representatives from the precinct's Internal Affairs Division, a couple of high-ranking officers, and at the far end, a man in a suit whom Brian instantly recognized as Marcus Davis. Marcus's presence was like a punch to the gut. Brian had hoped that he wouldn't be there, that he wouldn't have to face him again. But there he was, sitting calmly, his eyes focused on Brian as if studying him. The look in those eyes was the same as before, calm, unflinching, but with an edge of quiet authority that made Brian feel small. Captain Bennett took her seat at the head of the table, motioning for Brian to sit in the chair opposite her. When he did so, trying to ignore the way his palms were sweating. The room was silent, the weight of judgment heavy in the air. "Officer Harkins," Bennett began, her tone formal, "this review is to determine the appropriateness of your actions during the arrest of Mr. Marcus Davis. We will go over the events leading up to the arrest, your conduct during the arrest, and the consequences that have followed. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" "Yes, Captain," Brian replied, his voice low but steady. He glanced briefly at Marcus, who was watching him intently, before returning his focus to Bennett. "Good," Bennett said, nodding. "Let's start with the incident report. According to your statement, you arrested Mr. Davis because you believed he was a suspect in a recent series of robberies. Is that correct?" Brian nodded. "Yes, Captain. I saw him in the park, and he matched the description we had. Tall, black male, early 40s. He was acting suspiciously, so I approached him." "And what exactly was suspicious about his behavior?" Bennett asked, her tone neutral but probing. Brian hesitated, knowing that his answer here was crucial. "He was alone, just sitting there, and when I asked for his ID, he was evasive." "Evasive how?" Bennett pressed. "He didn't want to show me his ID right away," Brian explained, though even as he said the words, they sounded weak to his own ears. "He seemed like he was hiding something." Marcus's voice cut through the air, calm but firm. "I was reading a book, Officer Harkins. Not exactly the behavior of a criminal on the run." Brian flinched slightly at Marcus's words but kept his focus on Bennett. "I was just doing my job, Captain. I was trying to protect the community." "And did you find anything on Mr. Davis that would indicate he was involved in any criminal activity?" Bennett asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Brian shook his head. "No, Captain. He was clean." There was a pause, a heavy silence that filled the room as everyone processed what had been said. Then one of the internal affairs officers spoke up, his voice stern. "Officer Harkins, did it ever occur to you that Mr. Davis might have been telling the truth? That he wasn't the suspect you were looking for?" Brian hesitated again, his mind racing for the right words. I was following protocol. We're trained to be cautious, to assume that someone might be dangerous until proven otherwise. But did you consider that your assumptions might have been influenced by factors other than protocol?" the officer asked pointedly. Brian's throat tightened. He knew what they were getting at, and he knew there was no good answer. "I didn't mean to profile him," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "I was just doing my job." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze still fixed on Brian. "Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Harkins, not to judge people based on their appearance." Brian met Marcus's eyes, and for a moment he felt a surge of defensiveness, but it was quickly followed by a wave of guilt. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when he was wrong, And this was one of those times. Captain Bennett cleared her throat, drawing the room's attention back to her. Officer Harkins, this review isn't just about what happened that day. It's about the mindset that led to your actions. We need to ensure that every officer in this precinct is upholding the values of fairness and justice. This isn't just about you, it's about the integrity of the entire police force. Brian felt a sinking feeling in his gut. He knew that this wasn't just about whether or not he had made a mistake, it was about whether he was fit to continue wearing the badge. The realization hit him hard, and for a moment he struggled to find his voice. "I understand, Captain," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to." He stopped, the words choking in his throat. Captain Bennett softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. "We all make mistakes, Harkins, but it's how we deal with those mistakes that define us. You need to think very carefully about the kind of officer you want to be." There was another long pause, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone in the room. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice calm but carrying a weight of authority. "Captain Bennett, may I say something?" Bennett nodded. "Of course, Mr. Davis." Marcus stood up, his presence commanding the attention of the room. He looked directly at Brian, his expression serious but not unkind. "I understand that being a police officer is a difficult job. You are under constant pressure, and sometimes that pressure can lead to bad decisions. But we can't allow those bad decisions to go unchecked. This isn't just about holding Officer Harkins accountable. It's about ensuring that something like this doesn't happen again." Brian listened, his heart heavy. He knew Marcus was right, but the truth of it was hard to swallow. He had spent his entire career believing he was doing the right thing. But now he was faced with the reality that his actions had caused harm, that his biases had blinded him to the truth. Marcus continued, his voice steady. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's career, but I am here to make sure that the next time an officer encounters someone like me, they think twice before making assumptions. This is an opportunity for change, and I hope that this precinct will take it seriously." Captain Bennett nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mr. Davis. Your words are noted." Marcus sat down again, his gaze still on Brian. There was no malice in his eyes, but there was a firmness, a resolve that made it clear he wouldn't tolerate any further injustice. Captain Bennett looked at Brian, her tone softer but still authoritative. "Officer Harkins, you'll remain on temporary leave while we continue this review. I suggest you take this time to reflect on what's been said here today. We'll reconvene in a few days to discuss the next steps." Brian nodded numbly, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "Yes, Captain," he said quietly. The meeting was adjourned, and as the officials began to file out of the room, Brian remained seated, his mind racing. He had come into this review hoping to defend himself, to justify his actions, but now all he could think about was how wrong he had been. The realization was like a cold, hard truth that he couldn't escape. As the last of the officials left the room, Brian stood up slowly, his movements heavy with the burden of his thoughts. He glanced at Marcus one last time, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no animosity in Marcus's gaze, just a quiet determination, a resolve to see justice done. Brian looked away, unable to hold Marcus's gaze any longer. He knew that he had a lot to think about, a lot to come to terms with. And as he walked out of the conference room, the weight of his actions and their consequences hung over him like a dark cloud. Captain Laura Bennett sat in her office, staring at the stack of reports on her desk. Each piece of paper represented a fragment of the truth she was trying to piece together. The internal investigation into Brian Harkins's conduct was underway, and it was her responsibility to ensure that every detail was thoroughly examined. She rubbed her temples, feeling the tension in her shoulders. The precinct had always prided itself on maintaining high standards, but this incident had shaken that foundation. Whatever the outcome, Bennett knew that the investigation would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Brian, but for the entire department. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the first report, the initial witness statements from the park. She had already read them multiple times, but each reread added weight to the growing evidence against Brian. The witnesses, all park-goers present during the arrest, described the event with stark clarity. Their accounts were consistent. Brian had approached Marcus Davis with an assumption that he was a criminal, without hesitation and without attempting to de-escalate. Bennett turned to the next report, the body cam footage. She had watched it several times, each viewing more uncomfortable than the last. The footage was clear and unambiguous. Brian's voice, his tone, and his body language reflected the assumptions he had made from the moment he saw Marcus. The aggression in his approach, the way he had disregarded Marcus's attempts to explain, the force he used during the arrest. It was all there, laid bare for anyone to see. A knock at the door pulled Bennett from her thoughts. She looked up to see Detective Harper, her second-in-command for the investigation, standing in the doorway. "I've got the last of the witness interviews," Harper said, holding up a file, "and I've scheduled Marcus Davis for later this afternoon." "Thanks, Harper," Bennett replied, taking the file. "How's it looking?" Harper sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Not good, Captain. Most of the witnesses are pretty clear about what they saw. And from what I can tell, the body cam